You can drive across half of Europe without ever knowing what is beneath your wheels. In the last 2 years of the war, Nazi Germany went underground. It hollowed out mountains, poured concrete by the million tons, and hid whole factories from the bombers. We found 10 of these complexes, and most of them have been mapped, catalogued, and explained. Most. Stay through to number 1, a warren of tunnels in the Owl Mountains of Poland that the Germans themselves codenamed the Giant. Prisoners died building it in their thousands, and nobody has ever established what it was for. Number 10 begins above ground, which is the point. Before you go under a single mountain, you have to understand what all that digging was meant to protect. Number 10. The Wolf's Lair, Gierloz, Poland. Deep in the Masurian forest, 8 kilometers east of the town of Ketezin, you come across a cluster of concrete blocks the size of houses, cracked open and sinking into the trees. This was Hitler's Wolf's Lair, his main headquarters on the Eastern Front. Organisation Todd began clearing the forest for it in 1940, and Hitler arrived in June 1941, the day before he launched the invasion of the Soviet Union. He would spend more than 800 days here. By 1944, the site held over 80 buildings and around 50 bunkers, some with walls up to 8 meters thick, ringed by 3 security zones, minefields, and anti-aircraft guns. Forced labourers built much of it. Up to 2,000 people lived and worked inside a fenced compound in the middle of nowhere. It is best known for one afternoon. On the 20th of July, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg left a briefcase bomb under a conference table a few feet from Hitler. It detonated. But the meeting had been moved to a wooden hut because of the summer heat, and a heavy table leg took the blast. Hitler walked out with a torn uniform and a burst eardrum. He left for the last time that November. In January 1945, with the Red Army closing in, German engineers packed the bunkers with explosives and tried to erase the place. One bunker needed 8,000 kilograms of dynamite. The concrete barely cared. It cracked, lifted and settled, and most of it is still standing. Today, the ruins draw more than 300,000 visitors a year. It is the only site on this list where you can buy a fridge magnet on the way out. To find the first thing the Germans actually buried, you have to leave the forest and cross the continent to a wood in northern France. Number 9. The Blockhouse of Epaulettes, near Watton, France. In a forest north of Saint-Omer stands a slab of concrete 22 meters high, streaked and stained, with a crater beside it deep enough to hide a house. This was meant to be the launch site for the world's first ballistic missile, the V-2. Hitler ordered it in March 1943. Rather than fire his new rockets from mobile trailers, he wanted a vast bomb-proof bunker that could store, fuel, and launch them by the dozen, and produce their liquid oxygen on site. Organisation Todd built it with Soviet prisoners of war and conscripted labour. It was too big to hide. Allied reconnaissance spotted it, and on the 27th of August 1943, 187 American bombers wrecked the half-finished structure in a single raid. The Germans gave up on launching from it. Instead, they finished one corner as a liquid oxygen plant and left the rest as a scarred shell. The RAF was not done with it, not even close. They came back with tall boys, 12,000-pound bombs designed by Barnes Wallis to punch deep into the earth before exploding. The crater you can stand beside today is 18 meters deep, and it was made by one of them. The site was never once used to fire a rocket at Britain. It absorbed 27 bombing raids for nothing. It stands now as a private open-air museum, the concrete left exactly as the bombs found it. Walk up to the base of the wall and put your hand on it, and it is still cold, even in summer. The Allies had photographed the whole area and guessed its purpose within months. The Germans kept pouring concrete anyway. 8 miles south of that ruin, they tried again, and this time they went properly into the ground. Number 8. La Coupole, Visernus, France. Set into the face of an old chalk quarry is a concrete dome 71 meters across and 5 meters thick, weighing 55,000 tons. From the right angle, it looks like a landed flying saucer. Beneath it, the Germans cut a spiral of tunnels into the chalk to build, arm and launch V-2 rockets on an industrial scale. This was the replacement for the ruin at Epelec. After that bunker was bombed, Todd engineers chose a quarry 12 kilometers south and had a different idea. They would pour the dome first, on the surface, as an umbrella no bomb could crack, and then hollow out everything underneath it in safety. Historians call it the earliest direct ancestor of the modern underground missile silo. The target was London, 188 kilometers away, and Hitler wanted a dozen rockets a day falling on the city by the end of 1943. Around 1,300 workers dug the tunnels, many of them Soviet prisoners. The dome held. Everything around it did not. The RAF dropped tall boys again, and although not one struck the dome itself, they churned the quarry into landslides, buried the launch tunnels, and left the whole hillside sliding. By July 1944, the Germans admitted it could never work. Not a single rocket was ever launched from here either. The bombing killed 55 people in the neighbouring village of Helfhout instead. The dome still sits in its quarry, unmoved and unmovable. Since 1997, it has held a museum, and you enter through the one rail tunnel the bombs left open. Number 7. Vemork, near Rjukan, Norway. So far, the war underground has been about launching things. Number 7 is about stopping something before it could ever be launched. High on a shelf of rock, above a Norwegian gorge, stands a tall stone power station, the kind of building that looks like a cathedral by accident. When it opened in 1911, it was the largest hydroelectric plant on Earth. By the war, it was doing something stranger. It was the only place in the world mass-producing heavy water. And heavy water is what you need to run a reactor toward a bomb. That single fact made this remote valley one of the most important targets in Europe. The Germans held the plant. The Allies were terrified of what its output might feed. Bombing it from the air meant killing the Norwegian town below, so the job went to a handful of men on skis. In February 1943, 6 Norwegian commandos parachuted onto the Hardanger Plateau, met a team already freezing in the wilderness, and on the night of the 27th, they climbed down an icy gorge, crossed a half-frozen river, and scaled a cliff the Germans thought no one could climb. There is a reason this raid is still taught in Special Forces schools. They walked into the basement, laid charges on the heavy water cells, and destroyed the lot without firing a shot. Not one man was lost that night. If you are finding these worth your time, take a second to subscribe, because there is a version of this list for almost every country in Europe, and the next few sites are the strangest of all. The one waiting at number 1 has never been explained. The plant is a museum now, and the sabotaged cellar, sealed under rubble for 40 years, was reopened to visitors in 2022. From here, the list goes properly underground. It stops being about rockets and starts being about the machines that could have changed the war in the air. Number 6. Weingut 1, in the Mulhdorf forest, Germany. In a wood in Upper Bavaria, half buried under earth and moss, lie the broken remains of a row of colossal concrete arches, snapped like ribs, with rusted steel bursting out of them. The codename meant Vineyard 1, which was somebody's idea of camouflage. It was going to be a 9-story underground factory for the jet engines of the Messerschmitt 262. The design was clever and cruel. Workers raised a huge hemisphere of gravel, poured meters of reinforced concrete over the top, and would then dig the gravel out from underneath to leave a bomb-proof cavern. Once buried under soil and planted with trees, it would vanish from the air. Building it consumed people. More than 10,000 labourers were driven through the site, and the core of the workforce came from a subcamp of Dachau, most of them Hungarian Jews. Of roughly 8,300 concentration camp prisoners sent into that forest, close to half did not come out alive. Those too weak to lift concrete were shipped to Auschwitz. And after all of that, therefore, nothing flew. The arches were never finished, no engine was ever built, and the war ended with the structure a shell. The Americans found it in May 1945 and photographed it, baffled, labeling their aerial map a semi-buried installation. Decades later, the state tried to demolish it and gave up because it is nearly indestructible. It is a protected memorial today. The warning signs around the arches say, in plain German, "Deadly danger, no trespassing." They are not being dramatic. If Weingut was meant to hide a factory in the dark, Number 5 put a runway on the roof. Number 5, the Rehmag works at Wolpersberg near Kahla, Germany. A flat-topped sandstone hill above the river Saale, threaded with 30 kilometers of tunnel, with the faint scar of a runway still visible along its summit. This was the Reich Marshal Hermann Goering Works, and it was built to churn out the same jet fighter, the Messerschmitt 262, deep inside the mountain where no bomber could reach it. The Germans took over an old kaolin mine in 1944 and drove its tunnels out to 30 kilometers. The plan was extraordinary. Assemble the jets underground, carry them up the hillside on an open railway lift that climbed at a brutal angle, and fly them straight off a runway laid across the top of the hill. It half worked. On the 21st of February 1945, a Finnish 262 took off from the summit. But only around 27 aircraft ever left, against a plan for over 1,000 a month, and the cost of the attempt is written into the hillside. Over 12,000 forced labourers dug those tunnels, and roughly 2,000 of them died doing it. You will reach the largest tunnel complex of all in a few minutes, and the one nobody has ever explained. This one at least had a clear purpose. It simply came too late to matter. When the Americans arrived in April, they salvaged enough parts to finish a few jets and took the technicians home. When the Soviets took over, they blew the entrances and stripped the runway. The hill is quiet now. Stand on the top, and the only sign that anything happened here is a stripe of flatter grass where the fighters once lifted into the air. The same jet, the same idea, one country south, and a far darker ending. Number 4, Berg Kristall at St. Gorgon an der Gusen, Austria. Under a hill in Upper Austria runs a network of tunnels covering 50,000 square meters of floor, wide enough to drive a train through, and they did. This was one of the largest underground factories the Reich ever brought into real production, and it built the fuselages of the Messerschmitt 262. Digging began in March 1944, and the labour came from Gusen II, a camp so brutal it was called the worst satellite of the whole Mauthausen system. The prisoners tunnelled, and they died, in numbers that are still argued over, somewhere in the many thousands. Trains full of new prisoners arrived faster than the work could kill the ones already there. And unlike most sites on this list, Berg Kristall worked. Nearly 1,000 jet fuselages passed down its underground lines. Then comes the part that is hard to say plainly. As the war ended, there was a plan to seal the tunnels with the slave workers and the local witnesses still inside, so that nothing and no one survived to talk. It was not carried out. A Swiss Red Cross delegate named Louis Hayfliger and a local official talked the SS out of it in the chaos of the final days, and thousands of people walked out alive who were meant to disappear. The Americans liberated it in May 1945. The Soviets later dynamited the key tunnels, and in the 1980s, the main railway entrances were destroyed for good. Most of Bergkristall is sealed under that Austrian hill right now, with the dead still in it. Everything you have seen so far was built to make weapons. Number 3 is the one that actually rained down on London, and the place that made it is the darkest name on this list. Number 3, the Mittelwerk, inside the Konstein, near Nordhausen, Germany. 2 vast parallel tunnels run clean through a mountain of soft rock, joined by dozens of cross chambers, the walls still lined with the wreckage of an assembly line. This was the factory that mass-produced the V2, the rocket that fell on London and Antwerp. And it is the reason a place like Number 1 could even be imagined. After the RAF bombed the rocket works at Peenemünde in August 1943, the whole program was ordered underground into an old fuel depot in the Konstein. Prisoners from a new camp called Dora were sent to enlarge the tunnels by hand. What happened next is among the worst things in this whole story. For months, the prisoners were not even housed above ground. They ate, slept, and died inside the tunnels, 4 to a bunk, with no daylight and oil drums for latrines. Around 60,000 people passed through the Dora camp system. At least 20,000 of them died. 1 in 3. Some were worked to death, some starved, and roughly 350 were hanged inside the tunnels, some from a crane, as a warning to the rest. Around 6,000 V2 rockets were built here. More people died making them than were ever killed by them. Remember the promise from the start that most of these places have been mapped and explained. This is the fully documented one, understood in appalling detail. The Americans stripped it for rocket parts and shipped its engineers to Alabama. The Soviets sealed the entrances in 1948. A short section reopened in 1995. People walk it quietly. There is nothing else you can really do in there. The Mittelwerk is the one we understand completely. Number 2 is its opposite, and it sits only an hour's drive away. Number 2, the Jonastal tunnels near Ohrdruf in Thuringia, Germany. A quiet wooded valley with a line of blocked openings in the hillside, fenced off, on land that is still a military training ground. Between the autumn of 1944 and the spring of 1945, prisoners cut around 25 tunnels into these hills under a code name that meant only Special Construction Project 3. The labor here came from Ohrdruf, the first Nazi camp the Americans ever reached, the one that made General Eisenhower physically ill when he walked through it. Around 20,000 prisoners were driven through the valley. Several thousand died. In the final days, more than 100 Russian prisoners of war were simply murdered as the site was abandoned, and Jonastal keeps its secret. What was it actually for? That is the part that still does not make sense. It was too elaborate for a simple bunker, and never finished enough to prove anything. The likeliest answer is a last-ditch headquarters for Hitler himself, a hole to run the war from when Berlin fell. Some claim it was meant for wonder weapons, even for nuclear tests nearby, and the valley has been dug over by treasure hunters and conspiracy theorists for 80 years. No document survives that settles it. The tunnels were sealed, the Soviets fenced the land, and the German army holds it still. Everything the Reich buried to keep it safe from the bombers, it ended up hiding from itself and from us. Which brings us to the one it hid best of all. Whatever the giant was meant to be, they built more of it, buried it deeper, and left even less behind to explain it. Number 1, Project Riese, the Owl Mountains, Lower Silesia, Poland. Riese means the giant, and for once the Nazi codename is not an exaggeration. Spread through a range of forested mountains in what is now southwest Poland are 7 separate underground complexes, linked to a castle on a hill, and together they may be the largest thing the Third Reich ever tried to build. Not one of them was finished. Barely a tenth of the tunnels were ever lined with concrete, and after 80 years of digging, surveying and arguing, no one can tell you for certain what the giant was for. Work here began in 1943. When Hitler decided the pace was too slow, he handed the project to Organisation Todt and fed it with prisoners. The labour came from a ring of 13 camps under the nearby Gross Rosen concentration camp, and the prisoners were mostly Jews, brought in from Auschwitz as the demand for bodies grew. They bored into the mountains with drills and dynamite, hauled the rock out by hand, and were worked, frozen and starved, in conditions designed to use them up. Of the many thousands sent here, records suggest around 5,000 never left. So what was it? The German records were destroyed or never kept, which is itself telling. Albert Speer, the man in charge of the whole armaments program, wrote after the war of pouring more concrete into these mountains than had been spared for air raid shelters for German civilians. He put the workings at over 200,000 cubic meters. Today, less than half of that has ever been found. Which means that somewhere under the Owl Mountains there may still be tunnels no one has walked into since 1945. The theories rush in to fill the gap. A final fortress headquarters for Hitler, safer than the Wolf's Lair. An underground weapons factory like the Mittelwerk. A vault for looted gold and art, which is where the legend of the buried Nazi gold train comes from. The most honest answer, from the historians who know the site best, is bleaker and simpler. It was a panicked, gigantic attempt to move the command and industry of a collapsing regime underground at any human cost, and it ran out of time before anyone wrote the plan down. You can visit 3 of the complexes today. At one of them, Vlodars, the tunnels are flooded, and you go in by boat, gliding through black water under a mountain, past side passages that simply stop. The guide will tell you honestly that they still do not know where some of them were going. Nobody does. That is the giant. 10 complexes then, dug into the crust of a continent by people who were never meant to survive the digging. They tell one story between them. In the last 2 years of the war, as the bombers took the sky, the Reich tried to pour itself into the ground, and it used human beings as the tools to do it. Most of these places have been mapped, dated and understood. The tunnels are measured, the camps are named, the dead are counted as closely as anyone can count them. And that is the part worth sitting with. Because the real question is not what the giant was for. We may learn that one day, from a surveyor's report or a diver in a flooded tunnel. The harder question is, why a country will bury tens of thousands of people alive in the rock to build something it never even got to use. There are more of these than you would like to think, all across Europe, most of them still sealed. Subscribe and we will go down into the next 10 together. Thank you.